Hello, thanks for coming to my channel. I want to talk a bit about the BBC. As it approaches its centenary, assuming I continue this channel, I will likely be making more videos on the subject coming up to the actual centenary, which is going to be in a few years. The BBC was launched, I believe, in 1922. That makes it one of the world's oldest broadcasters. It also happens to be arguably the biggest broadcaster in terms of employees, in terms of scope and scale. But I think it's definitely facing one of its rockiest periods in its history. And I think this is a combination of the political atmosphere with growing backbench opposition to the BBC as an institution, conservative backbench, I should say, um, populism against the BBC for a lot of reasons, and also changing technology. And if the BBC doesn't really look at itself, I think it could actually become defunct. And let me just prefix this video because there's a lot of angles I want to take with this. Let me just prefix this video by saying that if the BBC were to become extinct, for want of a better term, if it was to dissolve, if there was no longer a BBC in the near future, I do think that would be a very sad thing. Because I do feel that the BBC is an integral part of British culture. And before people dismiss that, I would ask them to consider just how influential the BBC has been over the last century. It's profound. It really is profound. I mean, when you consider the cultural impact of some of its flagship programs, too many to name here, but it really is profound. But there is unquestionably a lot of contentions and challenges that the body faces. Um, so I want to just look at a few of them. This is by no means intended as an exhaustive video. I've touched on this before, no doubt I'll touch on it again. The BBC's just got a new Director General, Tim Davie, who said that he's going to, be seriously looking at reforms to the institution if it is to survive. I've just read in the Times that ITV, the head of ITV, and this is a report by Matthew Moore, that's Peter Bazalgette of ITV, said that it was quite right to question how the BBC was funded, but said that he personally supports some system of guaranteed public subsidy. Um, Here's the thing, it's kind of a balancing act because for those of us who don't want to see the BBC go, I think it's hard to see an alternative to some sort of public subsidy. The problem is, as I see optics. The BBC, in my opinion, really needs to look at how it's perceived, and it's too obsessed by diversity drives. This is not what the wider public is demanding. Now, it may be that some left wing academics and woke activists are demanding that, but the BBC is already pretty diverse. In fact, a recent study found that rather than having underrepresentation on screen, minorities in some ways are overrepresented. That is to say that the perception that they are underrepresented doesn't add up to the actual screen time in terms of per head of population and so on. So, in other words, if you were to consider what the percentage of Black Britons and Asian Britons was, and then how much screen time there is, if you actually break it down, it's not an underrepresentation. But the diversity thing, I think, is in some ways a distraction from inherent problems that the BBC has. By the way, I'm not saying diversity isn't important. Obviously, in a diverse country, as Britain is, it's important that the national broadcaster reflect that. So I'm not sort of having this knee-jerk right-wing reaction, so, oh, that's all nonsense. Not necessarily. I do understand it's important, but I do think it's a distraction at the same time. And I also think that there are clear examples of blatant tokenism and diversity for diversity's sake. I mean, if you have a period drama like Downton Abbey, um, which I don't know if that's a BBC production or not, I can't remember, but just use that as an example. The overwhelming majority of the cast is white, but that's set in a 1920s stately home where that's likely to be the situation. Recently, there was some controversy over the casting of a black Anne Boleyn. Now, the problem there is, apart from being obviously historically inaccurate, it just reeks of the worst sort of woke identitarianism because goes without saying that if you were to cast a white woman as, say, Harriet Tubman, or a white person as Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King, or any other famous historic black figure, the outcry would be deafening. So I cannot see any rational reason for having a black Anne Boleyn other than just saying, "Oh, look, we are being radical." It's ridiculous, and no scholar of history would take that seriously. There's nothing against the actress. I mean, actors and actresses take the opportunities that they can. Um, but to me, that just reeks of the sort of tokenism, and no, it's worse than tokenism. It's actually just trying to distort history to pander to woke politics. It's absurd. It is absolutely absurd. Um, but to get back to the issue of the BBC and where it stands, here's the problem as I see it. To many, many people, BBC is not a loved organisation. It is seen as an out of touch, elitist, arrogant giant. And because of the power and influence that it has, I feel many people do feel powerless and sort of essentially standing up to it. Sure, they have a complaint system and there's Ofcom, which in my view is not a very impressive organisation. They feel I don't have a good impression of Ofcom because I think they've been utterly weak on countering hostile foreign bodies like RT and CGTN. So to me, that really doesn't cast them in a good light as being sort of adjudicators of fairness on British television. But with the BBC, a big problem is optics. So many people feel that the BBC is run by left-wing, in inverted commas, lovies who have never been outside the M25. Now, I don't think that's an entirely fair perception. I do think the BBC's improved over the years to be more regionally diverse. So, for example, if you look at the BBC now versus the 1950s, in the 50s, it really was all received pronunciation, Queen's English, Oxbridge educated home counties. I mean, that was the BBC. Um, on some level, that's probably still true, but I do think that that's one area where it's probably improved, better regional representation. Um, I mean, there's now prominent people in the BBC who are not Londoners, Hugh Edwards, for example. There's others, but I still think there's that perception that it's kind of a London club. Um, I mean, one could argue about where the headquarters should be. I personally don't really have a problem with it being in London, in the capital city. I do think that the optics are there. Now, this is an organisation that has no shortage of controversies. One of the most glaring and obvious recent ones was, of course, the Savile Scandal, when basically for years BBC executives essentially protected this evil man, who turned out to be one of Britain's most prolific paedophiles. And public figures who did speak out, like Johnny Rotten, were sidelined. Um, that's a disgrace. The current new Director General actually oversaw an investigation into that. That's why it's just one of many reasons why the BBC needs to be careful on moral pontification because their own record is pretty dubious. Um, Now, the whole left wing, right wing thing, this is a very subjective thing. If you speak to a typical UKIP supporting Brexiteer, they would be convinced that the BBC is a lefty organisation run by wokes. That's her perception. If you speak to a Jeremy Corbyn supporter, it's a globalist organisation run by closet conservatives. So I do think that there is an issue there of they're never going to be able to please everyone, politically speaking. I do think on balance it's definitely more left wing than right wing. I don't. Corbyn supporters can say it's a right wing organization. I think that's delusional. Just because it isn't their brand of left wing doesn't mean there isn't a left wing tilt there. Um, I mean, I think it's very, very difficult for any broadcaster to be absolutely 50-50 impartial. I think it's very difficult. CNN indeed said our job, they have this kind of promotional thing. Our job is not to be neutral, it's to be truthful. And I do broadly agree with that principle in journalism, to look at the journalistic side. I mean, if you have, for example, um, you know, uh, a mass murdering tyrant versus a refugee, you're not going to say they're on the level playing field. You're not going to say that a serial rapist is on a level playing field with victims. Oh, let's just hear both sides. So sometimes, the idea of absolute neutrality when it comes to journalism is clearly absurd. It isn't workable, and it's not reality. However, I think it's right that Davy's taken a hard line on paid BBC executives, presenters, sort of pontificating on their political opinions. Now, one could argue if they're doing it in their spare time, on their own Twitter accounts or whatever, that might be an issue of personal conscience and so on. But if they're doing it under the BBC banner, that obviously brings the organisation into disrepute. So I do think he's right to take quite a hard line on that because the perception of political bias is so deeply entrenched against the BBC. Now, to me, one of the most glaring issues is the licence fee. And just to continue that report in the Times, this is the last few paragraphs. This month, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, opened negotiations with the BBC over the cost of the licence fee from 2022 to 2027. At present, it is pegged to rise with inflation. Ministers have also appointed an expert panel to shape the future of the public service broadcasting in the UK. The government has retreated from plans to decriminalise non-payment of the licence fee after the BBC said a civil enforcement regime would involve bailiffs being sent into people's homes. So the BBC's attitude seems to be, oh well, we've no choice. I I don't accept that there is no option about decriminalising it. I don't see why it can't be simply made a civic offence. I understand the argument. It needs to be paid for somehow. And you have BBC broadcasting without ads that you would get on other channels. So it has to be funded somehow. I accept that. What I don't accept is the optics. When BBC executives are getting ever richer, their salaries are rising every year, yet the TV license is also rising every year, and they're basically okay with people being threatened with jail, as if they're dangerous criminals for not paying a license. Now, whatever you think of whether people should or shouldn't pay a license, surely common sense and reason would suggest that shouldn't be seen as a serious crime. It shouldn't even be a crime. It should be a civic offence. So I think that is, frankly, I think it's repugnant. It makes me very angry. Um, the license fee is currently £157 a year. So it's not exactly a small amount of money. Um, it's a bit like, big executives of railway companies getting fatter salaries whilst the public is constantly being let down by sloppy service. Um, in the case of the BBC, I don't think it's that the quality is bad. I actually think the BBC, and this is why at the start of the video I said I'd be sad to see it go. I still think it has some of the best broadcasting in the world. I think it has world-class documentaries. I think it has some very good, iconic programs like Doctor Who. I'm not even a big Doctor Who fan, but I recognise that. And there's other examples. I think BBC News, whatever people might say about bias, I think the actual quality of journalism still is far, far exceeding the likes of Fox News. And I do think there's less pontificating on the BBC. People might disagree with this than there is on other networks. Far less than CNN, for example. I mean, CNN's been taken over by punditry. and it's also often accused of being a liberal lefty broadcaster. This isn't to say that there isn't, opinionated people on the BBC. I'm not saying for a second that there aren't examples of polarizing punditry. There is, but for the most part, if you look at BBC News, it's just reporting the news, right? It's not, this is the news and this is our opinion of it. They're just reporting it. Now, people can say fake news. As one of the negative side effects of Trumpianism, that everything gets dismissed and it dangerously plays into the hands of Moscow and Beijing. But I would say the overall quality of reporting is still a pretty high standard. Um, so I guess for me personally, I kind of have this love-hate relationship with the BBC. I I love some of the cultural sides of it. What I mean by that is things that are iconic, to British culture. Blue Peter, Doctor Who. There's many other examples, right? David Attenborough, wildlife documentaries. I mean, imagine British culture without those things. I think it's quite hard to do, actually. So I guess that's the love side. But then the hate side is the arrogance. I do think it's a profoundly arrogant organization. And I think that their failure to understand public anger at the license fee issue, I'm not talking about paying the license fee, but the fact that it's a criminal offence. Tim Davie and others at the BBC just don't seem to grasp it. They don't seem to understand that as they get ever bigger salaries, the public sees that and they see a deep unfairness. Um, so if I could have one thing change, for me that's an even bigger issue than the perceived bias, because it comes down to an issue of elitism. I think it's a very profound issue. It's not just it shouldn't just be dismissed as a mild irritation or the license fee. It's a question of fairness, and I do not think it's fair that BBC executives get ever bigger pay packages, whilst they claim that they have to raise the license fee um, to go with inflation. Well, then their salary should match the changes in inflation. Um, so I do think that they need to really grasp that what the public is asking for is not more diversity and more box ticking. The public want the BBC to to basically understand the wider country, and I'm not so sure that they do. Um, I would say to those though that want to totally discard the BBC, okay, we have Sky News. I'm not a massive fan of Sky News. I think it's kind of Britain's answer to Fox, although it's probably of a higher standard. But if the BBC goes, then there's an open market, and then the likes of RT and CGTN could really creep in. Ofcom's shown itself to be utterly useless when it comes to really holding them to account. Um, the BBC is always going to be, by its sheer size and influence, is always going to be controversial on some level. But I do think there are things they can do to improve their reputation. Firstly, they need to publicly admit when they get it wrong. Secondly, they need to empower the public more. I know they have a complaint system in position, but it's quite complicated. It's not a straightforward thing. You try complaining to the BBC, you have to go through a dozen different channels to actually get a straightforward feedback. So I do think that can entrench the sense of elitism. Like, they're distant and they're not really in touch with people's contentions. And I also think that the double standards, I mentioned bias, I will touch a bit more on that actually, because the Lawrence Fox situation is a good example of this. That Question Time event, actor Lawrence Fox, the Fox has said he would never apply for a role in the BBC because he wouldn't get it. Why? Because he is a white man who is refusing to be apologized for being a white man. I mean, the whole optics of that situation was that it's not that the BBC put words into that academic's mouth, that was her opinion. But the perception is that the BBC protect people like her and promote people like her, whilst trying to put up barriers to people like Lawrence Fox. Again, it's optics. I don't think the BBC is ever going to please everyone. I think that would be an impossible task. But I think that Mr. Davey needs to understand the optics here. And for many, many people, for everyone who loves the BBC and sees it as a valuable part of British life, there are many, many others who see it basically and as an elitist liberal club. That might be an unfair perception, but that is the perception. And I don't think they've done anywhere near enough to counter that. I mean, their answer to that is let's have more diversity quotas. What they should be doing is, frankly, listening to critics. I'm not saying it means they have to disagree with what critics are saying, but they have to at least listen to them and understand where those contentions are coming from. Because if this organization is to survive, it needs to adapt not just to changing technology and society, but also to understand the perception it has. And I'm not so sure that they do. I could be wrong. I don't know what paperwork goes over Tim Davies' desk. Um, but I do think there are bad optics, particularly, given the massive salaries that BBC executives get. They're paid, there's a lot of BBC executives get paid a lot more than the Prime Minister. They are in a position of responsibility, and I'm sure they work very hard, but there's an optics issue there. There really is. No doubt there'll be more to say on the subject, but I would close with this. If the BBC don't start listening to people and understanding public anger on issues like the license fee and really trying to communicate that, I mean, they can say they don't set it or they they have no other choice, but I don't think they're doing anywhere near enough to communicate with the public to say that this is why we do it. I think they need to communicate a lot better and say, and they would help their case by saying they don't favour criminal prosecutions. Like, I don't understand why the BBC would be opposed to making it a civic offence as opposed to a criminal offence. They say, like, having an alternative system would mean bailiffs coming around. I find it very hard to believe that's the only answer. That's the only alternative. Um, I mean, fundamentally, it is preposterous that anyone is threatened with prison for not paying a TV license. I think that is repugnant, actually. I'm not saying people shouldn't pay the license, by the way, but I don't think the BBC understands the anger around this issue, and I don't think they're doing anywhere near enough to address it.